Wonderful. Thank you so much, Herb. And yes, we're going to run this as a two-tone act with my husband, John Bowie, piping in especially about the global documentary series that several of you have been involved with. So I greatly appreciate the Europeans, including some of our stars, Victor Schmedecek and Renaud de Richter, joining it at a perilously late hour. I'm not very good after about 10 p.m. And thank you to the Australians and anybody else in the Australasian region for joining at a perilously, sometimes early hour. So yes, by quick way of introduction, we would like to run this pretty interactively. I will show some slides, first about our Global Restoration Collaborative, which brings a number of global networks together to accelerate action in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Then we will speak a little briefly about our global documentary series, which supports and accelerates the messaging around that. John and I come from different parts of the world. I was born in the USA, but quickly escaped off to Africa and Canada. I've been living in Southern Africa and working there on biodiversity, climate change, environmental observation systems, national development, social change for about 34 years of my life and 4 years in Canada. John, I think you can introduce yourself in a second as well. But we are both calling in from the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the former, sadly, temperate rainforests, old-growth rainforests of Washington State up near the Canadian border. John, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, I mean, literally just hi. I think it'd be great to just get on with your presentation. Thanks. It's nice to be a part of this.
Okay, John is the real filmmaker. I'm just the dumb scientist. So if I can go ahead, Herb, it says that you'll need to enable my participant screen sharing before I can show the screen.
I'll do that.
But just while Herb's up to doing that, I wanted to say, although I'm a scientist, I've been really lucky to work in governance and in public policy and national development in Namibia and South Africa for much of my adult life. And that's given me a really, I think, kind of surprisingly lovely and privileged ability to work across scales, from the very fine scale of the vulnerability of birds and other species to climate change, land use change, and so on at a fine scale. And then up to the global level, representing Namibia at the UN, working on big global initiatives. I've always been impatient with any one element, just trying to pursue any one of these elements of the symptoms of ecological overshoot in order to find a solution. So what I will tell you when I'm able to share my screen, which I now can, is that, just give me a second to get back up to the top slides, is that we have much to do in a perilously short amount of time. So first about the Global Restoration Collaborative. We all know that the world is spinning faster and faster, hotter and hotter. We are virtually out of time to be able to interact, interject, shift our global civilization. And therefore, if we have not already started to be big, bold, ambitious, blunt, pushing the envelope at every stage and being less concerned about diplomacy than about action, now is the time to do that. So here we are convening a global shift process. Hang on. I occasionally, only rarely, have this problem with being able to bring on extra text. At COP27, John D. Liu, the famous ecosystem restoration activist, a cameraman, filmmaker, soil scientist, and I bumped into each other at a panel that John Bowie and I were giving there on this documentary series we'll tell you about, and decided that the two big communities of ecosystem restoration networks globally and climate restoration networks globally, a much newer, much smaller set of people, needed to get together, to talk, to speed things up, and to run that collaboration through the engine of youth leadership and to some extent women's leadership, to increase the stability of our climate and planet and therefore our civilization, and to hasten our, to increase the probability of us all surviving the gauntlet of the next few decades and centuries. We decided to push very big and ambitious goals and develop this convening process rather than a new organization, more a collaboration to convene groups that normally weren't talking to each other. And some of the really important verbs here were to accelerate, to align, to upskill, in other words, train up and upscale planetary and climate restoration, to cross-pollinate between these networks, to very much break outside the, I think, underwhelming agency boxes of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration in particular, and to guide this process, which I think is incredibly powerful, with plenty of youth energy, intergenerational mentorship and partnership, and the voices of Indigenous women, Indigenous people and women in particular, who have not been really well represented in these aspects. So these verbs you'll see sprinkled among these slides. These are stretch goals, and I want to make that clear, but they are sorely needed. And in fact, things that we've put here for 2050, we'd like to achieve by 2040, hopefully some of them by 2030. 1 billion people globally engaged in restoration. And here I'm talking about things that actually can shift the global economy from being an extractive one, a predatory one, really, to a regenerative one. At least 30 gigatons of carbon a year annually removed from the atmosphere. I don't like to be redundant, sorry. Over 2 billion hectares of land globally under restoration, the majority of the world's major watersheds under restoration, and at least to quadruple the existing goals for coasts and oceans. You may, some of you, be aware that the European Parliament yesterday passed a really important, big, somewhat more ambitious ecosystem restoration goal. I don't feel we have any choice. I think most of us here are here because we know that we have very little choice but to shift the entire way the planet and our society and our economies work. In this collaboration, we are currently focusing on 4 specific areas, and we are busy just elaborating all of these right now. We are at the development, co-design, and fundraising stage. I'm particularly working with John D. Liu, Dennis Garrity, Leonard Iyamuremye, who is a young climate activist, very savvy, strategic one from Rwanda, on these 4 areas, which I think are some of the most important things to get underway. And we can talk more about that, but I'll leave that up to the discussion. In terms of who we are, as of today, these are the organizations that are involved. I might also add the UN Development Program as a likely incoming partner through the Ecosystem and Biodiversity Division of UNDP, run by Midori Paxton. And if you haven't come across Midori Paxton, I will try to remember in the discussion to put in an article that she just wrote a couple of months ago in Fortune on why the degradation of the planet should be construed as a serious financial crime and prosecuted as such. So in order to support all of this work, we need to raise its visibility, its strategy, its messaging. And so about a year ago, John and I had been approached by Peter Fikowski, whom many of you will know, to develop a global documentary, a single documentary on climate restoration. And I'll probably let John take over in just a sec. We essentially agreed to do so on a couple of premises. One, that we would have considerable editorial and content autonomy. You going to sit here? Okay. Okay. Oh, all right. All right. Sorry, John's just handing the ball to me to talk about this. No dogs. I'm sorry. It's always when you start to talk that the dogs start barking at somebody who comes to the door. Back to Our Future was initially intended as a single documentary of roughly 45 minutes to an hour to talk about climate restoration. But apart from having significant complete editorial independence, we also advised that this would be much more than a video about Peter's book. We felt that there was a need for a global survey, an assessment, a reporting of the status of climate restoration, not only to inform people, but also significantly, I think many of us realize that we have not had enough understanding of the global community that we even have any agency left. So many people believe that across the board, it's too late. And that's an extremely damaging thing. Yes, it's too late to avoid the inundation of many coastal cities around the world. Yes, it's too late to keep under 1.5 degrees, most likely overall. We've already likely hit it or will hit it globally within the next couple of years. And we all know how significant the fluctuations in climate are. But also that it is not too late to influence the survival of species, the ability to survive and flourish of children in the world, the ability of us to maintain some semblance of civilization. So we realized, A, we had a lot of footage that we had shot, and B, a full-blown survey of the field was needed. In many ways, climate restoration is very much not talked about. It's probably the biggest thing we're not talking about. And so we've started it out with very much a broad, global, sweeping line that we are at the crossroads of humanity. We need to make a choice. We can either reclaim our agency and our collaborative abilities that have been eroded by divisive culture wars in some of our countries, or we could just become nihilists and give up, which will certainly be the worst of our options. So our documentary series, Back to Our Future, is trying to raise global awareness that we can choose this future. It's trying to survey the state of play with broadly 4 different sets of nature-based restoration technologies, and we can discuss these in the group chat afterwards, and to emphasize how really we are well past the stage of any individual single silver bullet, but that everything that we know how to do to shift this huge Titanic of a global civilization, a global globalized economy, we need to pull out all the stops. It is really a everything, everywhere, all at once moment for humanity. So this is more or less what you will find if you look at our some of our production website at backtoOurfuture.net. I would encourage you to go look at that. We are in advanced pre-production now. Here you'll see one of our people here, Professor Victor Schmedecek, whom the crew interviewed in Bremerhaven in Germany on the work that he has done on experimental trials for ocean iron fertilization and permaculture, marine permaculture with sargassum seaweed. And we have been trying to bring in a number of different scientists, politicians, economists, activists, social justice advocates, and so on. Because it's never been just about the science, is it? It's also been very much about making it happen, getting us not just envisioning the future, but how we get there from here. And how we get there from here is, of course, a very complex, delicate balance of governance, policy, regulation, economic shifts, social public perceptions, etc., etc. Fundamentally, we've got to be really clear amongst ourselves. And I don't think everybody is in this community broadly in which we all work. Everybody needs to be clear that this is not a stopgap that allows us to continue with our wasteful Western lifestyles. Stabilizing the climate only buys us a little bit of time, if we're lucky, to make really bold, fundamental, transformative change in both our societies and our economies, but also in our mindsets, our expectations, our sense of entitlement and convenience and comfort. We need to be clear that with 8 billion people on this planet and increasing expectations of many of those people to material comfort and well-being, that there is no way that we can retain affluent, wasteful lifestyles in the global north, and indeed among the affluent in any country, because there are billionaires in Lagos and Santiago and Rio, just as much as there are almost anywhere now. So I am sorry that John wasn't able to stay. He's working very much to deadlines, but I'd like to invite you to look at our website, backtoOurfuture.net, and look in more detail at our 3, possibly 4 episodes. We have had a bit of a financial shock in the progress of the documentary, and so we may not be able to finish it if we don't get some help. So I would urge any of you who are thinking, I know somebody that might be able to come in as an executive co-producer and be able to fund the completion of this documentary in its originally planned 4 one-hour episodes or 7 shorter ones. Please let them get in touch with me. We've got a pretty good team. John has worked globally on many big issues for society. We have, sorry, that overlap wasn't meant to be there. We have Peter Coyote as narrator. We have as a co-executive producer the actor Alexandra Dowling from Game of Thrones and the Musketeers. Cameron Curry, our DP, director of photography, is another Emmy winner. And so we are very lucky to have a good team. There are even a couple that aren't mentioned here. So we will be continuing to work 16 and 17-hour days until this is done. But we would appreciate your help. Everything that we know and love is at stake. And it's very important to break this out into the public arena so people can talk about it, realize its possibilities, help make it happen by voting for the right people, by funding the right things if they can, by helping join this vast community that I'm trying to convene to get 1 billion people around the planet engaged directly and a little bit indirectly in ecosystem and climate restoration, and really helping society shift into its new civilization, what may be left of it. And so I'd like to really let you look at these 4 episodes just for a second. We are just about completing episode 1. We have a great deal of work done already on 2, 3, and 4 if it exists. If we end up with enough material for 4 full episodes with the current budget that we have, which is very constrained. And I'd be happy to talk with you all and hear from you all about the work that you may have to contribute to this. So I'd really like to leave it there. And Herb, if you're willing, just to open it up for conversation, in a much more interactive way. So appreciate your attention. Really delighted to see Renaud Director and Victor Schmedecek, among others there, and probably other people that have joined while I've been speaking. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Phoebe. That was really inspiring. And at least speaking for myself, there's not one word you said that was in any way inconsistent with, quite the contrary, totally supportive of what HPAC is advocating. And I think vice versa, though there's certainly differences in emphasis between your work and ours, but they seem to be completely compatible. And I was intrigued when I saw the slide that showed your partners of your website, whether there was any room to add HPAC as a partner.
I'd love to talk about that. Sure. We are dealing with global partners that have some direct contribution to restoration, and I think that sounds like a worthy conversation to have, for sure.
Okay, then we will have that. We will add that on our to-do list after today. Okay, I'm just going to open it up to folks. As we usually do, I would suggest you raise your electric or electronic hands, and I will do my best to track you down and go in the order of the hands as best as I can. Looks like we have Philip. So Philip, and then after Philip, Mike, my 2 neighbors from Montgomery County. Go ahead, Philip.
Phoebe, it's wonderful, very heartening to see how much work you put into both the collaborative and the film. John, good to meet you, and Godspeed on everything you're trying to do to pull this all together. I wanted to, Herb asked me to think about a few questions. I'm going to just start with one, which is to ask you to highlight girlplanet.earth and what's happening there. I think, as Herb mentioned, all of us in many different groups are having a tough time trying to engage young people in some of these kind of solution seeking that's going on. And I note that you talk about Girl Planet being a forum for people to share stories and discuss solutions to some very tough problems: overconsumption, overpopulation, and the health of our planet. It's quite daunting to think about making policy when you tell people, you're consuming too much, you're having too many kids. So I'm just curious as to what may be emerging. Can you highlight that forum and share with us how we can help?
Sure. I haven't talked about any of this during this talk, but I'm just putting the link in the chat for those of you who've never heard of it. My day job, such as it is, because there's no money in it at the moment either, is the CEO of the Stable Planet Alliance, which is a global collaborative of quite wonderful, dynamic, and lively and respected organizations and experts around the world on Earth overshoot. And that focuses on population consumption and now human mindsets. And although the Global Restoration Collaborative website is currently on Stable Planet, as I mentioned to a group that Philip and I were in the other day, it will likely move institutional houses. But Girl Planet Earth is our first project in Stable Planet Alliance, which invites women and older girls around the world to really talk about their personal stories of personal choices in this overcrowded, damaged world and what they feel about it. We don't tell them what to talk about as long as they're roughly in the frame of, human health, planetary health, personal choices. They can talk about culture, law, careers, child-free lifestyles, whatever they may wish to talk about. And so for those of you interested in that stuff, I would welcome you to look at that site, particularly the tab that's called Our Global Voices. And there's roughly 100 women from, I think, about 50 countries around the world so far, and a few coming in each week, talking on this theme. So Stable Planet Alliance is trying to reduce the demand on the Earth. The Global Restoration Collaborative, not being content with that, I set up the Global Restoration Collaborative to increase the supply of skilled, regenerative people that collaborate and are bringing their voices to the table, sometimes for the first time, to work for the admittedly aging, largely white, somewhat more male than female ecosystem restoration community, so that we could really help fund it, get it up to scale, and accelerate. So I'm doing a bit of supply and demand stuff here. Philip, I don't know whether that answers your question or not. Thank you for it.
Okay, Mike.
Well, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm a climate change scientist. I'm interested in numbers and what can actually be done, and things, and so perhaps a little bit of a devil's advocate here. Your chart indicated that you wanted to get up to 30 gigatons of carbon per year removal. That's 3 times the global fossil fuel industry today that you want to get up to. I mean, I don't know if you meant CO2 or you meant carbon, but if you mean carbon, that's 3 times the size of the present global fossil fuel industry. That would take tremendous amounts of energy resources to make that work. In addition to the energy resources that one has to replace so we stabilize climate, given that fossil fuels are 80% of the world's energy today. So that to me, and to do this, I guess, by what is it, 2050 or something? I mean, that seems almost it would be wonderful if it could happen, but it seems way beyond practical kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
So, well, I want to ask one more question. I mean, another thing that, sure, if I may, that I know Peter advocates is sort of aiming back for a global population of 1 billion, and your indication was to aim for people going back to a much different lifestyle, and I much less consumptive, much less affluent lifestyle. And I guess I'm wondering how that goes as an appeal to people to do that, as opposed to just sort of keep going as they are? How does one attract people to a lifestyle that they and most people won't still be in? I mean, you'll be down to a very low population, as opposed to aiming for something where there's, plenty now of potential renewable energy resources for the world that could generate enough energy to actually sort of possibly sustain a much different world than going back to 1 billion people living off the land. And so I guess I'm curious about both the practicality and then how this notion of where you're aiming is attractive to the world to get them to do that.
Okay. Hold on. I've just, I need to get you back. As I touched my computer, my hypersensitive computer suddenly popped up all kinds of other fields, and I want to be able to see you. Thank you, Mike. Those are two big questions. Answering them exhaustively is not on the table right now in this place. Answering them quickly, I guess I just want to start by saying I've worked in government much of my life in Southern Africa, but also global government. And in government, we tend to operate thinking a little bit about carrots and sticks to achieve behavior change. Nature is the big stick here. We may not have the luxury of choice and being able to attract people to lower, less consumptive, less wasteful, less frivolous lifestyles. It would be nice to think that humanity was smart enough to be proactive and wise, befitting our supposed name, to move there voluntarily. There's not a lot of evidence of that happening on the scale that we need it to. So in terms of attraction of people to lower lifestyles, and in terms of the stabilization and then gradual reduction of our population, I want to point out a couple of things. One, there's not a lot of active behavioral choice that's needed here. Approaching even human population from a fundamentally justice-oriented, women-centered, child-centered approach. All we have to do is really continue educating women, continue emphasizing the rights that women, children, and future generations have and must have in law. Populations will decline pretty rapidly on their own. A lot of people get stricken when the word population is even mentioned because they believe wrongly that it is a scary word that involves some kind of coercion. Frankly, the only coercion that's really going on in most of the world right now is coercive pronatalism, encouraging women and others to breed more and more rather than less and less. From our justice-based, education-centered, right-centered approach, we are already shifting the population. In Stable Planet Alliance, we are aware of multiple goals, such as the one that Chris Tucker and Peter Fikowski have set up, which are stretch goals, unattainable, but important for opening the dialogue of a total fertility rate of 1.5 by 2030, or a stabilized global population declining by the mid-century and achieving 3 billion by around the year 2130 comes to mind. We're not so concerned about the goal as the process, the dialogue, the policies to get the whole planet walking in the right direction. So that's all I'd like to say about the matter of shifting consumption and population. You also just briefly queried the 30 gigatons a year. And I guess I would refer you to a series of calculations between Jim Hansen, the Global Carbon Project, and Dennis Garrity, that help substantiate that. They are a little bit ambitious. They are there are assumptions that still need to be confirmed, but we sure as hell need stretch goals right now. We have to make it happen if we are going to
I'm not able to hear you, Phoebe.
Stabilized, miserable. Robert,
Phoebe, can you hear me,
how about
Phoebe?
now?
I
Yes,
wasn't
I
hearing.
can hear you.
Okay, but we weren't hearing. At least I wasn't
Can
hearing
anyone
you.
else?
You're coming in, and I'm wondering if you turn your camera off for a minute, if that might help.
Yep. Can you hear me now?
So far, let's see what happens. All right,
Okay.
Robert,
I
Chris.
was going to ask Robert.
If I can, just a second.
Go ahead. Sure, Mike.
Well, follow up with one thing. I mean, one of the reasons that areas that HPAC is different is that, we're sort of advocating that climate intervention needs to be part of it to try and stabilize the temperature now so we don't keep getting worse and worse. So that's sort of one difference with you. And on the population question, while the numbers sort of go that way, it seems to me, I haven't seen any analysis about whether the population age distribution provides enough workers to accomplish all that is being proposed. Because I think what you end up with is fewer and fewer younger people and workers and more older people where there's a requirement to deal with that. And that seems to me to be quite a challenge to also be thought about.
Mike, with respect, I was asked not to come to talk about the work of Stable Planet Alliance, but to talk about ecosystem and climate restoration. I would refer you to the book by Vegard Skirbeck, the Norwegian economist and demographer, called Decline and Prosper. I will try and find it and put it in the chat, but some of you will probably get there before me. It's an excellent book, which basically shows us why we don't need to worry about those things, that we need to definitely be proactive and farsighted in terms of our economic and maternal birth and health policies, but that's entirely within the scope of societies around the world to do that. And so here's the link to that. Hold on, the wrong thing pasted, but I will put it in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. If we have time, Mike, for any other follow-up, we'll come back to you. I want to turn it over to Robert. Chris.
Good evening. I'm having for the first time on one of these calls to use my mobile phone because I'm having some connection problems here. So I'm hoping it is working. You can hear me, okay?
Yes.
You can.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Great. Yeah. 2 points really. You touched on the first, which was this question of the transition. I mean, you talked very, very eloquently about the transformation that needs to take place, particularly in the Western developed societies. And I think we'd all recognize that. And my own personal view is that there are, broadly speaking, two ways that this can happen. One is orderly and the other is disorderly. And obviously what we'd all prefer is for it to be orderly. But I am a little bit, I'd be interested in your views about how the deep transformation that you're talking about that is required by people who enjoy all the benefits of the fossil fuels have given us, how they're going to willingly and happily make this transition. That was the first question. And the second, completely unrelated, you talked about some financial strains in terms of completing the fourth episode. It would be helpful if you're able to give us some sense of the order of magnitude of the funds you're looking for. Yes,
sure. Thank you, Robert, for raising that. we are looking for about $450,000 because we ended up having to take over the self-funding of this series at a time when we had just moved back from careers in Africa to an expensive country. So we don't want to be at the stage where we have to pop cyanide pills in the next couple of years, which is likely to be the case if we don't. But we are looking for executive producers, co-producers, who might be able to put in 20,000, 50,000 or 100,000. We have 2 at the moment. We would like to find a couple more depending on the investment. If you happen to know people who understand the power of film in shifting global minds and public policy, please introduce them to me. But yes, it's unfortunately quite a significant thing. In terms of voluntary transitions, the grand sweep of human history is not very reassuring on this line. I think most of us know that large-scale social change often only happens when fate comes up to bite us in the face and the butt at the same time. And so I only hope that we can get enough people to shift the balance of intention and the balance of action. We know that in many respects for behavior change, that can be a relatively small proportion of society. But in terms of emissions and in terms of our other impacts on the planet, whether it's biodiversity or whether it's social services, plastics pollution, ocean plastics, all of these things are symptoms of overshoot. And if we can get sufficient action on that, particularly on stopping the systemic supply of plastics, the systemic waste and leakage of methane, for example, all of these systemic changes need to happen fast. And I think that we are in a good position where the tide is turning, the wave is cresting on many of these issues. So we really need to keep up the pressure. But in terms of individual change, there are a lot of people that are just going to twiddle their thumbs until the world around them collapses. And I guess our challenge is to try to minimize that as much as possible. Thank you for those questions.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Ron?
Thank you, Phoebe. I'm afraid I may have to follow up on some of the Mike's points and other issues. I think we are aligned very much in the goal of regeneration, planetary regeneration, whether it will be the old system or new, and the old ecology or a new ecology, or but yes, absolutely. Draw down in many of Peter comes often to many of our meetings or other meetings of similar groups, so we all know him quite well.
You mean Peter Fikowski?
But I don't want to necessarily. But my the question I have, one is a question: if you were, say, a president of a very poor country like Ecuador, this is a real example you may be familiar with, a leftist who really supports, understands the climate crisis and wants to do something about it, and you discover oil in the Amazon rainforest, and you ask for the world to help, provide half the funding that you would make by drilling for that oil and selling it. The world says no, and so drilling proceeds. This is the quandary, I think, that we're facing, that, in terms of a transition to the kind of, I call it the farmer cultivation society, industrial farmer cultivation civilization that we and natural regeneration that we are all pushing for. And I think we do have to hold out as the hopeful future. If we get through Sinai, we can get to the promised land. That might be a much more equitable and just promised land, because
discovering the oil in a particular place will not give you the ability to extract, enormous wealth, concentrated wealth, and exploit other people as much, hopefully. But in the meantime, we're faced with this problem of the transition. And so I think, we have been very much focused on, we need to have a tourniquet. There is no way, and I think, Mike can correct, but I think, the calculations of how to get to this new civilization, or even to get to the goals of the IPCC, any of them, the 1.5, the 2.0, you name it, are just not realistic. They're not at all realistic. And so in the meantime, for some of the reasons I just stated, so in the meantime, we have to cool. We have to find a way to apply a tourniquet, a Band-Aid, a triage, whatever you want to call it, a way to keep things from getting out of control, both nature and civilization, frankly. A billion refugees, we're seeing all the results right now. Is that going to cause fascism, or is it going to cause, a better world? I think we are very much focused on this transition problem, on having to, and that's where the cooling, and I know that, Peter, back when I started he was very inspiring for me. I was listening to his work on cooling, and then he dropped it. And that, to me, was very, very disheartening, because I think that is actually the most urgent, highest priority right now, to get to that better world that we all want to get to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ron, for that. You're absolutely right to raise all the messy parts of the plate of spaghetti that we're heading into. If we've been taught anything in the last decade, it's that we ignore the lessons of history about fascism, for example, at our peril. My observation is that many people who are talking about impracticality are the ones who are embedded in the system and above a certain age. And we think, yes, that's because we know how the world works. I was lucky to be involved in these two countries of my life, Namibia and South Africa, at crossroads of their own history. Namibia's independence, South Africa's post-apartheid democratic transition, at times when those countries could ask, what kind of a society do we want to have, and how are we going to get there from here, to really slam on the brakes on some things and shift gear hard. And humanity, in my view, is at the same moment now. So the question is, to what extent do we find a balance between the carrots of enticement, the sticks of either natural disasters, or a fiat of hopefully benign autocratic rule that this is going to be the way humanity has to be for the next 10 years if we're going to do this. I've long felt that democracy, as much as we all love it, is never going to be up to these challenges. So I don't have an answer for you, except that it's going to be messy, and our job is to try and keep the tiller steady while allowing the ship to shift. And that may sound, like an oxymoron, but we've got to figure that out.
So to expand on Ron and Mike's comments, the issue is that tipping points are looming quite rapidly, and the only way to mitigate that risk is to increase planetary albedo. And part of the difference that we have had as a group with the Healthy Climate Alliance is, as Ron explained, that the geoengineering technologies that are required to increase planetary albedo are seen as too unpopular to consider. and that's a real challenge. You know, just that that managing planetary albedo is essentially the only way to prevent these sorts of dangerous tipping points, while the slower transformative processes of culture and economy that you advocating can gradually develop, Phoebe.
Yes, thank you, Robert. That's certainly the realm of the remaining fissure in the world as I see it in the climate restoration field. Our documentary series does not talk about solar radiation management. It does not talk about global cooling per se. I don't know whether Victor or Renaud would like to speak about methane and risk management about methane, but we all know that it is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas with high risks attached. Most people regard the moral hazards and geopolitical risks of solar geoengineering as remaining way too high, but I don't think that we can solve that issue here. Happy to have other people weigh in on this.
Victor.
Yeah, perhaps I could chime in here. I have a lot to say, but I will try to keep myself short. First of all, with regard to the solar radiation management, I come from India. I mean, my name doesn't, perhaps you all know that, I'm not sure, but I'm Indian. I'm an Indian citizen, right? I also speak Hindi very fluently. I could talk to you in Hindi now. Anyway, so I grew up in India, and I'm an Indian citizen, and I've witnessed the pale blue skies in India over the last 20, 30 years. And it's because of the pollution from burning coal, I guess, but also wood fires. So, and that has kept India cool. There's no doubt about it, because you see the difference between the whitish sky in India and the deep blue sky of my youth. There's a huge difference, and it's kept the place cool. So I'm not against solar radiation management at all, but we need to do research. And I think it's a stopgap. I mean, it will buy us time. But to get to the carbon problem, how do we take carbon out in huge amounts? We can't do that with the current biosphere, because the amount of carbon we have released to the atmosphere, fossil fuels, is sizably more than the biomass of all on the planet. Of the 550 gigatons of carbon is the biomass of the biosphere. So, and we have to take out several hundred gigatons of carbon to get back to a safer place. And the only place that could be done are those places that are not used and that are not on people's minds at all. And these are the subtropical gyres of the oceans. I'm an oceanographer. And I'm also dyed-in-the-wool biologist. I mean, I really look at the organisms. I'm not a I'm a biogeochemist, but a biogeochemist who also looks at the organisms doing the job, who are moving and shaking the elements that people like to model. And I must tell you that I'm very disappointed by the mathematical models going around these days about, what's going to work, not going to work, and so on, because, well, anyway, so the subtropical gyres are deserts. They are 50% of the Earth's surface, and they are in the subtropics. They abut on what we call the global south. And what could be done over there is to plant trees. I mean, the tree concept, the tree morphology in these subtropical gyres, these are deserts that are floating on a limitless aquifer, if you will, of nutrients in the deep ocean. And if these two are joined, are connected with pipes, with double pipes, you can get a flow, a thermohaline flow that will flow by itself at rates of cubic meters per second. If it done properly, we have to just put these pipes in place, and we would have trees, because the crown of the tree would then be floating seaweeds on the surface. So we could I mean, we could draw down huge amounts of carbon depending on how many trees we make, and these trees could be made on site. You know, I'm thinking like 10, 20 years from now, the manufacturing possibilities are going to be very different to what we have now. And these pipes I'm talking about would be made out of the seaweed, right? So these would be, it's nature-based because these are trees, but in the ocean where they didn't evolve. Trees didn't evolve in the ocean because of the distance, the 400-meter distance between the high nutrients at depth and the sunlit surface on the top. But that could be done. And then that's one aspect. And the space here is unlimited. We would just need 2 or 3% of the subtropical gyre area to get this thing done. Of course, the opposition is, at the moment, don't touch the ocean, leave the ocean alone. But this is by people who don't understand the ocean. I'm sorry, but I mean, I have done these iron fertilization experiments. I've been sitting on top of the plankton watching it. And I know that plankton can't do it because plankton simply doesn't pick up enough carbon with the nitrogen and phosphate. So we need algae, macroalgae that have much more carbon per nitrogen. I mean, we could even start but designing the macroalgae that make carbohydrate. They just make carbohydrate, and that would be then sunk, compacted into bales, like macroalgae in aspic, that will prevent any bacterial activity once the resources in that particular bale are gone. So it would be a permanent way of storing carbon. Okay, so that's that. The other thing is now, that's why I mentioned India. India is not talked about when we think about, not talking about India of today. I'm talking about antique India. And you all know that the Indian lifestyle is one of modesty and restraint, and where being modest is the meekness that Christianity has been preaching is very similar, surprisingly similar to the India of the antique. And I don't know whether you are aware of the Indian civilization, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley. These are civilizations that made big cities, and these cities were deserted, and nobody knows why at the moment. But after these cities were deserted, they were peacefully deserted. People just left. They went somewhere else. Where did they go? And what I think is they went to the Gangetic Plain and lived very modest lives. Instead of living in cities, they switched to water and wooden structures. And I think you know this much, that antique India was the paradigm of wealth, right? And not only wealth, they also preserved the biodiversity. India is the only, South Asia, is the only place outside Africa where the megafauna survived. So that's proof. Not only the megafauna, also the people. I mean, India has a very vast, outside Africa, by far the largest diversity, human diversity. So all the people there survive, all the languages survive. Not all, but I mean a huge amount, right? The only place where you have big cats, lions and tigers, elephants, rhinos, hadn't until recently, right? So they survived the Holocene, unlike other places. So there's something different about the Indian mentality or what was developed over there. Right, so I'll stop here now because I can get carried on and on and on. There's a lot to say here, but I just wanted to put these things in the conversation because they're not talked about. All right, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, and many of you will have read the Ministry of the Future and know the future projections of bilateral engagement of India on solar geoengineering.
Okay.
Herb, I'm in your hands.
Yes. First of all, thank you. That was really fascinating, Victor. And maybe we can get you back for a full session someday to expand on some of those ideas. Really appreciated that. My question is, I've got two questions, very different kinds of questions. The first is that, you know, we've sort of, even HPAC, we put things in boxes like the climate triad. Emission reductions is this box, and removal is that box, and cooling is a third box. But there's actually, in some cases, many cases, a lot of overlap between these boxes. And, you know, maybe we lose as much as we gain by that kind of classification. And I know early on when we first formed, and people like my friend and neighbor Philip, are you there now, Philip? Basically made the point, and groups like Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, that maybe we're underemphasizing the magnitude of the role that ecosystem restoration in its broadest manifestations can play in cooling the planet, in addition to or as part of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, or maybe even if they're not removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And that the IPCC has de-emphasized the water cycle, all the hydrology that influences what we feel, and so forth. And I'm probably messing up your assertions, Philip. But I guess I'd like to get you to comment on what is the rule or the role of ecosystem restoration, biodiversity enhancement, whatever terminology one wants to use, as part of an effort to literally cool the climate, which is, as Ron and others have said, one of our primary goals at HPAC because of, you know, the imminence of these catastrophic tipping points.
Thanks, sir, for that invitation. Was that to me, or do you want Phoebe to respond?
Let's go with Phoebe first, and if you want to make a brief comment after Phoebe finishes, that'd be great.
Oh, I was just going to deflect largely to Philip, but yes, I just want to emphasize that this is really the combination of vast, large-scale, human-driven effort, supplemented with a number of smaller number of people, but highly impactful technological issues. As an ecosystems ecologist, I stayed away from the ladder for a long time, but we have to look at the data and realize that carbon sinks are no longer able to absorb our burgeoning numbers and appetites, the waste from that. Philip, please go ahead.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yes, so some calculations were done in the last couple months that looked at the role that land use change, particularly the degradation of forests and the conversion of, you know, prairies to plowed conventional agriculture might have played in the heat balance of the earth, and determined, at least preliminarily, that at least as much, and perhaps as much as 6 times as much, of the heat flux is affected by land use change as is kept in by the increase in greenhouse gas blanket. So, you know, I could go on for a long time on this, but you all know that on a hot day, if you walk out and put your bare feet on concrete or asphalt, that ground can be much warmer than even the ambient air temperature. But if you walk over to the grass, it can be actually 10, 20 degrees cooler than the ambient air temperature, in part because, or largely in part because, those plants use between 40 and 70% of the sun's radiation for evapotranspiration. They take that heat and transpire it as water vapor, where it rises to the cloud layer, and at the cloud layer, the radiation from going from vapor to water phase is 13 micrometers. It's right in what's called the infrared window of the greenhouse gases. And at that elevation, somewhere roughly, the numbers vary between 40 and 70%, but say about half of that heat radiates to space. So where we are able to have, take bare ground, currently bare ground, plant grass, plant bushes, plant trees, that converts that ground from what would be an infrared heat source at the surface to something that's shedding significant quantities of heat to space. So that's our strategy, is to identify the priority areas, mostly adjacent to oceans, where we can draw in moisture and keep the atmospheric rivers feeding downwind. We are seeing a degradation of perhaps 25% of the northeast part of the Amazon in Brazil, where this radically, urgently needs to be restored in order to keep the water flowing into the rest of the Amazon basin. There are many other sites around the world like this where we think, you know, the green stuff is there, it self-replicates, it biodegrades, it recycles. You know, it's technology that's 2.8 billion years old that's been proven to work. We just need to help nature do it. We need to get out of the way of cutting it down and destroying it. So that's our kind of strategy.
Thank you, Philip. And I know, Philip, nobody is better than Philip at finding links. And maybe if not today, you can send out to the list some links that reinforce what you're saying and give people an opportunity to read more about the potential, which I guess, as I think it's fair to say, as in a lot of these sort of huge potential areas, we don't have the peer-reviewed research as much as is needed, or maybe even the non-peer-reviewed research, to be able to convince policymakers to make some radical changes in how they address what I call the joint sort of bioclimatic crisis. I noticed that Renaud in the chat said her one more box, quote, enhancing outgoing infrared radiation. So thanks for that, Renaud. My second question is gets away from the science and to the political, and that is, working as you do with all these groups for all these years in all these different countries. And, you know, we're about 2 years old. Action is one of the key words in our name. We find that finding potential allies with significant clout and influence and moral stature or money, and any or all of the above, has been challenging for us. Of course, we're a volunteer group doing this part-time, but I'm wondering whether you have any advice or any actual specific names of people, institutions, organizations that you have found to be friendly to these ideas. You know, clearly ours emphasizes a bit more because of the urgency, what we call direct climate cooling, but it certainly encompasses climate restoration and CDR. So I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for people or organizations that we can reach out to, or whether we reach out to them or not, that you have been impressed with as potential or actual regional or world leaders in this, you know, broad field that we're talking about.
I started my day, I'm not sure whether any of you were on the same call, 6 a.m. call with Sarah Scher's organization, Eco-Agriculture Partners, and the Global Blended Finance Landscaping program, which was an incredible demonstration of how one can find $700 billion in gap money for biodiversity and ecosystem restoration. And part of my role, it's almost sometimes my fourth full-time job, is trying to work with economic strategists and financial flow strategists to try and shift global financial flows in the world away from private profiteering and destruction of the planet towards public good activities. That is way beyond my own pay grade, and that's why strategic collaboration is good for all of us. The people that I work with know how to do those things. I don't myself. So I can only ask, I can only say that I think even many of the big agencies and the bigger and more impactful small NGOs are already shifting in this direction, particularly with ecosystem restoration. Climate restoration is still a long haul ahead. And if you haven't already had Sebastian Manhart to speak, I would encourage you to invite him to come and chat with you guys.
No, I have not. Is anyone here familiar with that name besides Phoebe? Maybe
I'll give you a link.
Yeah, you could send that along.
He's brilliant. Yeah,
Okay,
he's brilliant. And I think Rebecca has a question.
Rebecca?
Yes. Hi, Phoebe. Apart from, could we please have your slide deck? My question, I don't, if you could, but anyway, I'll let that you sort that out with the HPAC steering circle. My question is about what collaboration you currently have with Australian, either general regeneration experts, of which there's quite a lot, and in particular First Nations expertise. It's a very busy space here in Australia at the moment because most of our First Nations people are focusing on a referendum to Parliament about getting themselves recognised in the Constitution. And so it's also, that's the thing occupying the airspace. But there is a lot of discussion about, for example, burning and what they call cultural burning. And I've got two different talks that were given at the one of the Sydney museums, which there are transcripts of. So if you like, I could send those through to you if you haven't got them. But the general question is, just one more introductory statement is that the First Nations people were trying to reach out, for example, to the Australian Conservation Foundation and the peak environmental bodies here to say, how about getting our stuff onto your agenda? So anyway, I'd just be interested in any comments that you have about existing relationships with Australian regeneration experts.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good questions. I work with a lot of Australians, although mainly in the women's leadership space, which includes a number of Indigenous Australian and New Zealand women leaders, but not so much directly in the ecosystem restoration space. However, the Global Evergreening Alliance, to which the Global Restoration Collaborative will probably move institutionally, is and the Eco Restoration Alliance are the organizations that really feed onto the ground. At this stage, I'm only one person with very little money to feed myself. So I'm limiting myself to using my personal convening power for getting people I know that are championing all of these movements to talk with each other, cross-pollinate and beyond. The local links, I think, have to come through the established organizations, and we are not an organization, we're just a convening.
Well, do you know what, that totally aligns with what I was thinking, because that's what the First Nations people are doing here too. They're saying we've got expertise, but let's get the mainstream organisations to take it on. So I'm assuming, for example, Australian Conservation Foundation is part of what you're doing, and I'm so pleased that you're being totally sane about your own boundaries and time.
I'm not being totally sane or smart about it, actually. But yeah, I'm sticking to global players at the moment. However, in everything I do, I am strengthening the dialogue between Western and Indigenous decisions and histories and practices. And as a fire ecologist back in my history, I'm really interested in the issue of, the pros and cons of fire for biodiversity, for climate, and for culture. Would love to chat more another time, Rebecca. I'll put my email address in the chat.
Do we have time if there is one more question? If not, then just as you suggested, Phoebe, that we have to be, or Rebecca, mindful of our boundaries. First, I want to thank you so much for Phoebe for coming in the midst of your multiple boundary stretching activities covering the world. We really appreciate it and learned a lot from your talk and your wisdom today, and we hope that you will stay connected with us as we go forward on our mutually supportive agendas in the coming days and weeks. And thanks for everybody for coming today. And we hope you'll stay connected with us, use our list, share ideas, information, and enjoy the rest of the winter, summer, or whatever season you're in, depending upon where you are geographically and what your state of mind is.